For this one, it says the door is not closing properly because it is hitting the frame. And we've all probably experienced this at some time or another. You go to shut a door and like the door is rubbing somewhere and it won't quite shut right. Okay, so the carpenter measures the diagonals of the doorway of the opening, and he finds that one of the diagonals is 82 1/4 inches, and the other one is 82 3/4 inches. Okay, and so we want to explain, why is the doorway having an issue? Why is it rubbing? Why is it hitting? Why isn't this thing shutting properly? Okay, and so what I have drawn down here, so I've got kind of a makeshift doorway. I've got some fancy molding with a fancy little pattern on it. I don't know, it looks really great. But then here's my door. And the idea here is this, okay? When you build a door frame, you know it's a parallelogram because you make the opposite sides congruent automatically in terms of the way you build it, all right? The trick then is when you're installing those pieces that you know to be congruent, to make sure that it's a rectangle. And here's why. Look at the door. The door is a perfect rectangle. And for the door to shut properly, the opening must also be a perfect rectangle. See, when they're each a perfect rectangle, everything fits nicely. You put your hinges on and the door shuts perfectly. It fits into that opening perfectly because they're both perfect rectangles, all right? But what happens is, if I were to kind of take this and let me just kind of skew this off to one side. Let's say the door frame is not a perfect rectangle. Notice the pieces, the opposite sides are still congruent because I'm still building this with the same pieces. But if I were to kind of shift it this way, and this can happen for a lot of different reasons, either it wasn't installed right, or the house has settled a little bit as it's gotten older. But what happens here is this is no longer a rectangle. It's still a parallelogram. But what happens when I try to fit the door frame in here, notice it doesn't fit perfectly because one of them is not a rectangle. And what happens is people try to just go, okay, well, let me just hang the door on this side. But now it's hitting up here at this corner, and we can see that there's gaps and there's overlap and everything's all messed up. And it's because it's almost like the doorway is leaning, making it no longer a rectangle, okay? And the way to fix that is when you look at this thing and the thing the door attaches to, these pieces on the outside are really just covering up what's underneath. The pieces underneath are what determine whether this thing is a rectangle. And so this stuff around the outside is called molding. When you pop that off, there's usually a little bit of a gap between the door frame and the wall. And there's a gap there so that you can put, like, they're called shims, that'll allow you to kind of move those pieces back into place. So you could either move this piece a little bit closer to the wall frame in that gap, or a little bit further away, to try to straighten these out and ensure that you bring it back to a rectangle. And then after you have it back to a rectangle, you can easily put this molding back on and then reattach your door. And now it'll shut properly because they're both rectangles, okay? And we can check to see if it's a rectangle simply by measuring the diagonals. And that's how most carpenters will actually approach this problem. If they want to know if something is square, if something is actually a rectangle, if it's got 90-degree angles, they measure the diagonals and see if they're the same. And if they measure the diagonals and they're not the same, again, we're back to this situation. If I were to take this and measure the diagonals right here, let me use just a line tool. This diagonal right here is going to be shorter than this diagonal right here. This diagonal is actually going to be longer, the one that I'm drawing right now. This diagonal will be longer, and that tells me which way I actually need to shift the door as well, okay?